Have you ever looked at the world and wondered how intelligent people, with access to information and good intentions, end up defending absurd ideas or following destructive movements? How can brilliant doctors adhere to conspiracy theories? How can university professors support totalitarian regimes? How can educated people participate in virtual lynchings without a second's hesitation? What if I told you that, for psychiatrist Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human psyche, the greatest threat to civilization doesn't come from deliberately evil people, but from a very specific form of stupidity? Warning: we're not talking about low IQ or lack of formal education. On the contrary, the phenomenon Jung identified is even more disturbing precisely because it can infect the brightest among us. We're talking about a psychological blindness, a voluntary surrender of critical thinking that transforms ordinary people, perhaps even you or me, into vectors of social destruction. A condition that, unlike conscious evil, has no internal brake. That makes its carriers immune to reason, evidence, and dialogue. And that, for this very reason, represents a much greater danger to society than a villain who knows he's a villain. This is the devastating paradox that Jung discovered in his decades analyzing the human psyche, and which has never been as relevant as in the polarized times we live in. Why evil limits itself and stupidity doesn't? To understand the paradox, we first need to examine the nature of genuine evil, that which is conscious and deliberate. The genuinely evil person, in most cases, is aware of their acts. The tyrant who orders executions, the fraudster who deceives the elderly, the aggressor who humiliates the weakest, all operate from an egoism or sadism that, deep down, knows it violates a recognizable moral. This awareness, however suppressed it may be, creates internal conflict, psychological fragmentation. The conscious villain needs to constantly justify their acts to themselves, construct elaborate rationalizations, or simply ignore the uncomfortable voice of conscience. That's why Jung observed something counterintuitive. Evil carries within itself the seed of its own destruction. It generates resistance, both external and internal. It produces guilt, even if deeply buried. And eventually, it leads to psychological exhaustion. As Hannah Arendt noted, even the cruelest Nazis needed alcohol and drugs to bear the weight of their acts. In other words, conscious evil has an internal break, even if weak. The villain knows, on some level, that he is a villain. Here's the crucial and disturbing difference. The person taken by this functional stupidity that Jung identified doesn't see themselves as evil. On the contrary, they feel deeply virtuous. They piously believe they're on the right side of history, fighting for the great good, defending truth and justice. This unshakable conviction of moral righteousness is precisely what makes them impermeable to arguments, facts, or contrary evidence. Any information that contradicts their worldview is not just incorrect, it's morally correct. Any person who questions them is not someone with a different point of view, but an enemy of truth, an agent of evil. It's an impenetrable psychological armor. When your identity and your sense of virtue are completely fused with an ideology, or abandoning it wouldn't just be admitting an intellectual error. It would be admitting to being a bad person. And few have the psychological courage necessary for such internal confrontation. That's why, as Jung noted with growing concern during the rise of 20th century totalitarianisms, this functional stupidity has no brakes. Conscience, which should serve as a moral compass, has been completely co-opted by ideology. The superego, which should limit our worst impulses, now sanctifies and encourages them. As C.S. Lewis wrote, echoing Jung, of all the world's evils, perhaps none is worse than that practiced by men with absolute certainty that they are fighting evil. Their zeal is unbreakable, their determination unshakable, their blindness complete. And it's precisely this combination, absolute moral conviction with total psychological blindness, that makes this condition infinitely more dangerous than conscious evil. We can argue with a villain. We can appeal to their self-interest. We can even awaken their dormant conscience. But how do we dialogue with someone who has transformed their blindness into virtue and their rigidity into moral principle? Jung's 3 mechanisms. Now that we understand the diagnosis of the problem, let's dissect its psychological anatomy. How exactly is an intelligent and well-intentioned person captured by this condition that Jung? What are the psychic mechanisms that transform independent minds into voluntary servants of collective irrationality? Jung, in his vast exploration of the human psyche, identified 3 fundamental mechanisms that, together, create the perfect storm for this surrender of intellect. Let's examine them one, as recognizing them is the first step to not succumbing to them. Mechanism 1. The tyranny of the persona. The fear of not belonging. At the center of Jungian psychology is the concept of persona, a term Jung borrowed from ancient Greek theater, where persona was the mask used by actors. For Jung, the persona is our social face, the character we present to the world. We all have and need a persona. It's the interface that allows us to navigate social complexity. The problem arises when we completely identify with this mask, when we forget we're just playing a role. Here's the danger. When our need for acceptance and belonging becomes so intense that we're willing to sacrifice our own critical thinking to maintain it. Think about the implications of this. Group approval, whether political, religious, professional, or cultural, becomes more important than intellectual integrity. The fear of isolation, rejection, ridicule becomes more powerful than commitment to personal truth. A study conducted by Solomon Asch in the 1950s demonstrated this shockingly. When confronted with a group that unanimously gave an obviously wrong answer to a simple question, approximately 1/3 of participants abandoned the evidence of their own eyes and agreed with the group's error. This is exactly what Jung identified: the submission of individual judgment to group consensus. When this happens, the person stops being a thinking individual and becomes a mere spokesperson for the collective. Their thinking is no longer their own. It's a script provided by the group, repeated without critical examination. And here's the perfect psychological trap. The more the person repeats this script, the more convinced they become of its veracity. Not because they've critically examined its merits, but because of a phenomenon psychologists call cognitive dissonance. The human mind cannot bear to act one way and believe another. Eventually, our beliefs shape themselves to justify our actions. Yet, Mechanism 2. Shadow projection. Creating the perfect enemy. The second Jungian mechanism is perhaps the most powerful and dangerous. Shadow projection. The shadow in Jung's psychology is one of the most profound and disturbing concepts. It's the repository of everything we repress and don't accept in ourselves. Our flaws, weaknesses, destructive impulses, prejudices, pettiness, unacceptable thoughts. It's the part of us we don't want to admit exists. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because we deny it. On the contrary, the more we deny its existence, the more power it exerts over us in unconscious ways. And one of the most common forms of this power is through the mechanism of projection. Projection occurs when, unable to recognize certain dark aspects in ourselves, we project these same aspects onto others, usually an external group, the enemy, the other. As Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This mechanism is devastatingly efficient for 2 reasons. First, it allows us to maintain the illusion of our own moral purity. By locating all evil in the other, we preserve an immaculate self-image. It's not me who's intolerant, we think. It's them who are intolerant of truth. Second, it creates a perfect enemy, a repository of everything we deny in ourselves. This enemy is not just someone we disagree with. They're the very incarnation of evil. Not someone to be debated, but to be defeated, silenced, eliminated. The emotional satisfaction that derives from this simplistic narrative of us, good, against them, bad, is so powerful that it completely blocks rational thinking. The person becomes incapable of seeing nuances, of considering contrary evidence, of recognizing valid points on the other side. As Jung observed during the rise of Nazism, when an entire society projects its collective shadow onto a group, in that case the Jews. Barbarism becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The person becomes blind not because they can't see, but because the narrative of good against evil is psychologically much more comfortable. Mechanism 3. Psychic Epidemic. When madness becomes collective. The third mechanism is the most comprehensive and, perhaps, the most disturbing of the three. What Jung called psychic epidemic, or mass psychic possession. To understand this phenomenon, we first need to comprehend two fundamental concepts of Jungian psychology: the collective unconscious and the archetypes. The collective unconscious, different from Freud's personal unconscious, is a deeper layer of the psyche shared by all humanity. It's the repository of images, symbols, and behavior patterns that transcend cultures and epochs, what Jung called archetypes. These include figures like the hero, the wise man, the great mother, the trickster, the shadow, among others. In normal times, these archetypes operate silently, influencing our psyche in subtle ways. But in times of crisis, fear, and collective uncertainty, they can be activated en masse with devastating consequences. It's as if a psychic virus spreads through society. Jung witnessed this in Nazi Germany and warned of the phenomenon in his essay Wotan, where he described how the archetype of the Nordic god of war and fury had possessed the German soul. Charismatic leaders, consciously or unconsciously, personify these archetypes: the savior, the protective father, the warrior who will defeat evil. They touch not the intellect, but the deepest and most primitive layers of the human psyche, provoking an overwhelming emotional response that simply nullifies the capacity for individual reason. In this state of possession, people are no longer following a rational plan. They are participating in a powerful myth, an archetypal narrative that resonates with the unconscious depths of their psyche. They feel part of something greater, a sacred cause, a historical mission. It's an almost religious experience in its intensity. And as Jung observed, when this happens, people completely lose the capacity for individual judgment. Reason is sacrificed at the altar of collective ecstasy. As Jung wrote, modern man doesn't realize that all his rationality, which he so prizes, is at the mercy of underground psychic powers that he doesn't control at all. Understanding these three mechanisms, the tyranny of the persona, shadow projection, and psychic epidemic, is the first step to not becoming a puppet of them. It's the beginning of a journey to strengthen one's own mind against collective manipulation and the traps of the psyche. Jung firmly believed that self-knowledge was the only true defense against these forces. As he wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And if you're interested in this kind of deep self-knowledge, in psychological tools to navigate an increasingly chaotic and polarized world, subscribe to this channel. Our goal is precisely to offer this kind of transformative knowledge, based on the deepest insights of psychology, philosophy, and ancient wisdom. Because, as you'll see in the next part of this video, Jung didn't just diagnose the problem, he also offered a powerful antidote, a path to true psychological freedom amid the madness of the masses. So far, we've seen a disturbing diagnosis. Intelligent and well-intentioned people can, through the psychological mechanisms Jung identified, become vectors of irrationality and even destruction. The tyranny of the persona, shadow projection, and psychic epidemic form an almost irresistible triad that captures individual minds and dissolves them into collective madness. But Jung was not just a grim diagnostician of the human condition. As a doctor of the soul, he also offered a powerful antidote, a path of healing and psychological resistance. And it's here that his vision becomes not just relevant, but potentially saving for our troubled time. The antidote Jung prescribed for the madness of the masses is what he called the process of individuation, possibly the most central and revolutionary concept of all his psychology. Individuation is often misunderstood. It's not about individualism in the selfish sense, social isolation or rejection of community. On the contrary, it's the process by which a person becomes psychologically complete and whole, capable of recognizing and integrating all aspects of their psyche, including the darkest ones. It's important to understand, the truly individuated individual doesn't reject the collective. They relate to the collective in a healthier and more authentic way. As Jung wrote, individuation doesn't isolate, but connects the individual with the world in a deeper and comprehensive way. In other words, the goal is not to separate from society, but to develop a personality strong and integrated enough not to be swallowed by it. It's developing an internal psychological center so solid that you can be in the crowd without becoming. It's this inner strength that allows resistance to the three mechanisms of psychic capture we saw earlier. It's the psychological vaccine against the functional stupidity that Jung identified as the greatest danger to civilization. Let's now examine the practical steps of this transformative process. The practical steps of individuation. 1. Integrating the shadow. The courage to confront one's own evil. The first and perhaps most challenging step of individuation is the confrontation and integration of the shadow. Everything we repress and deny in ourselves. This is the direct antidote to the projection mechanism we saw earlier. When we recognize and accept our own dark aspects, our capacity for error, prejudice, pettiness, cruelty, we become much less prone to projecting them onto others. It's a deeply uncomfortable process. As Jung observed, it's not illumination that one should imagine, but darkness to be clarified. It's looking inward and recognizing that you too carry the seeds of irrationality, fanaticism, hatred, the same qualities you so easily condemn in others. But this confrontation, however painful, brings profound liberation. Those who know their own darkness are not easily blinded by the false light of others. Those who have recognized their own potential for error become more compassionate with others' errors. And crucially, they become much more resistant to the simplistic narrative of us, the pure, against them, the impure, that feeds the psychic possession of the masses. In practical terms, this work involves questions like, which qualities or behaviors do I most despise in others? These are often clues to repressed aspects of my own shadow. When do I feel excessively moral or virtuous about an issue? Which groups or individuals provoke a disproportionately intense emotional reaction in me? Shadow integration doesn't mean acting according to your lowest impulses, but recognizing their existence and learning to channel them constructively. As Jung said, I'd rather be whole than good. 2. Disidentifying from the persona. The courage to be authentic. The second crucial step of individuation is disidentification from the persona. Recognizing that the social roles we play are not who we really are. This is the direct antidote to the tyranny of the persona we examined earlier. When we psychologically separate ourselves from our social masks, we become much less vulnerable to group pressure and the fear of rejection that leads us to adopt irrational beliefs and behaviors. In practical terms, this work involves constant and honest questioning. Is this really my genuine opinion? Or am I just repeating what my group, political, social, religious, expects me to say? Have I really critically examined this belief, or did I adopt it to maintain my social identity? It's the act of asking, as philosopher Michel de Montaigne did, what do I know? An exercise in intellectual humility and psychological honesty that goes against all the current of ideological certainty. This disidentification requires genuine courage. The courage to be authentic even when it costs social approval. The courage to say, I don't know, in a culture that values absolute certainties. The courage to question your own group's beliefs when they contradict your experience or personal ethics. As Jung observed, collective statistics apply to the mass, not to the individual, and the mass is composed of individuals. Statistics would tell us that a man consumes a quarter of a chicken per day. But no man in my knowledge eats a quarter of a chicken per day. This type of independent thinking, which recognizes both collective reality and individual uniqueness, is what Jung considered essential to resist the madness of the masses. 3. Dialoguing with the unconscious. The courage to listen to the inner voice. The third step of individuation is establishing a conscious dialogue with the unconscious, becoming receptive to messages that emerge from the depths of the psyche through dreams, fantasies, intuitions, and artistic creation. This is the antidote to psychic epidemic, the emotional contagion that spreads through the collective unconscious. When we establish a conscious relationship with our own unconscious, we become much less susceptible to archetypal manipulation and the automatic emotional responses that demagogues exploit. Jung developed various techniques to facilitate this dialogue, including dream analysis, active imagination, and various forms of creative expression. The goal is always the same: to become conscious of the unconscious forces that move us, instead of being moved by them blindly. In practical terms, this work involves practices like paying attention to dreams and reflecting on their possible meaning, dedicating time to introspection through meditation, contemplation, or reflective writing, engaging in some form of creative expression that allows the unconscious to manifest, observing recurring emotional patterns, especially excessively intense reactions. As Jung wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." This is the essence of individuation, a progressive awakening to the deeper realities of the psyche, which gradually frees us from slavery to unconscious forces, whether personal or collective. It's crucial to understand that, for Jung, individuation was not just a personal growth project. It was also, and perhaps primarily, an act of political resistance in the deepest sense. In an era when he saw millions of people being swallowed by totalitarian ideologies, Jung argued that the only real defense against totalitarianism was not external, but internal. It was the development of psychologically integral individuals, capable of resisting mass pressure and maintaining their intellectual and moral autonomy. As he wrote in an essay during the rise of Nazism, the psychologically primitive individual is easily suggestible and becomes a defenseless victim of psychic manipulation. The more a man approaches the state of collective unconscious, the more likely he will become a victim of magical form. True freedom, for was not just political or social, it was fundamentally psychological. And the conquest of this inner freedom through individuation was, in his view, the only true guarantee against the external tyrannies that periodically sweep human societies. As he prophetically warned, political freedom presupposes psychological freedom. A population of psychologically non-individuated individuals, even living in a formal democracy, will always be vulnerable to capture by demagogues and totalitarian ideas. This insight of Jung has never been as relevant as in our era of extreme polarization, digital echo chambers, and manipulation of collective. The internal work of individuation is not a spiritual luxury. It's an urgent necessity for preserving freedom and sanity in our troubled time. We reach the end of this exploration of Jung's thinking about the danger of functional stupidity, that surrender of critical thinking that can transform intelligent and well-intentioned people into vectors of irrationality and collective destruction. The diagnosis is disturbing, but also profoundly liberating. Because what Jung ultimately shows us is that vulnerability to mass irrationality is not a matter of intelligence, education, or even superficial morality. It is, fundamentally, a matter of psychological courage. Functional stupidity is not a failure of intellect, but a failure of the soul. It's what happens when we abdicate the difficult and often painful task of self-knowledge in exchange for the immediate comfort of absolute certainty and group identity. It's what happens when we prefer the comfort of simplification to the complexity of truth. When we choose the security of the tribe over the vulnerability of authenticity. And here's perhaps Jung's most important and most uncomfortable insight. This vulnerability is universal. It exists in all of us. It's not a problem of them, the others, those we consider enemies of reason. It's a deeply rooted human tendency, a constant risk for each of us. In fact, Jung observed a disturbing pattern. The more someone considers themselves immune to this type of psychic capture, the more vulnerable to it they become. The person who says, "This would never happen to me, I'm too rational, educated, moral," is precisely the one most at risk, for they've lost what Jung considered the most important virtue for psychic health: humility. As he wrote, "Where is one's own understanding when it's most needed? It's unfortunately where it always was. Projected. The true knower is not arrogant." This is the uncomfortable truth Jung invites us to face. None of us is above or beyond the psychic forces we've analyzed. The tyranny of the persona, shadow projection, psychic epidemic. These are not just external phenomena we observe in the world, but tendencies that exist within each of us. The crucial difference is not between people immune and vulnerable to these forces, but between those who recognize this vulnerability and work consciously to resist it, and those who deny its existence and thus become its easiest victims. That's why Jung insisted that the true battle against mass irrationality and the tyranny it inevitably produces is not fought primarily in parliaments or battlefield, but begins and ends within each of our psyches. Lasting social change can only come from individuals who have done the internal work of individuation, who have integrated their shadows, disidentified from their personas, and established a conscious dialogue with unconscious. People who, in Jung's words, are not at the mercy of unconscious psychic mechanisms, but have some understanding of the secret way of the soul. And perhaps this is the most hopeful message Jung leaves us. However overwhelming the forces of collective irrationality may seem, however powerful the mechanisms of psychic capture, each individual always retains the capacity to resist, to awaken, to choose the more difficult and more courageous path of consciousness. As Jung eloquently put it, the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual. And what is more courageous than knowing who you really are? If this video made you question or think in a new way about phenomena we observe daily in our polarized world, if it illuminated dynamics you might have experienced in yourself or observed in groups you belong to, then we're fulfilling the mission of this channel. Because our goal here is not to offer easy answers or comfort with platitudes. It's to invite you to a dive into the depths of the human mind, armed with the tools that great thinkers like Jung left. It's to create a space for a type of reflection that becomes increasingly rare in our culture of quick reactions and cheap certainties. Subscribe to continue this journey with us. Each week, we explore a new aspect of depth psychology and its application to the most urgent challenges of our time. We don't promise comfort, but we promise growth. We don't offer certainties, but an honest exploration of the most important questions of human experience. And now, I want to know your opinion in the comments. Which of these three Jung mechanisms, the tyranny of the persona, shadow projection, or psychic epidemic, do you most observe in action in today's world? And if you have the courage for an even deeper reflection, which one do you most strongly recognize operating in your own psyche? Thank you, and until the next video, where we'll continue this journey of emotional liberation.